Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the second afternoon of Highways UK online. We've got a brilliant panel lined up for you. We're here to talk about challenging the preconceptions over the future of mobility. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Mott MacDonald, for their support for this. Broadly, we're going to be looking at the so-called case factors. So that's connected, autonomous, shared, electric, but other stuff as well. We've got quite a different panel for you, not the usual suspects that you might find at a typical Highways UK event. And I'm hoping that we're going to hear a number of different perspectives than you ordinarily would. While the session is running, I think you've probably picked this up already, but the main method of communicating with us is using the Q&A box on the platform. So stick your questions in there and we'll see what happens. So we're gonna use a mechanism this afternoon. We want to make it quick fire. We're just going to put forward a few myths and then we're going to see if they stand up. But first of all, I want the panel to introduce themselves. First off, I'm going to go to Jay. Jay, can you wave as you so people can see you? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jay Nagley. I'm an R&D specialist in the automotive team at the Department for International Trade. My background is car industry, most of my life doing market analysis, product planning, and helping companies plan for the future. Great,
thank you, Jay. Nick?
My name is Nikolas Badminton. I'm a futurist. I'm based over in Toronto in Canada. I'm originally from the UK. I work with R&D departments, researchers in the automotive industry, and I speak about how technology is going to change the world in the next 5, 10, 20 years.
Excellent, thank you. Fergus, tell us who you are, why you're interested in
Fergus. I'm Fergus Mcvey. I run a company called 7 Sense Research UK. We're a consumer and B2B and public sector research firm, meaning we do stuff like questionnaires and focus groups, but these days it's also online communities and big data stuff. Basically anything where an organization wants to know what people are doing or what they're thinking, they get us involved. We work for public sector stuff like the DFT, but also people like Rolls-Royce and Triumph Motorcycles, etc.
Great, thank you. And Patrick?
Hi, my name is Patrick Adison. I might be the opposite of Nicholas. I'm originally from Toronto and actually now based in London. In the UK, I'm a senior consultant with the integrated city planning team at Arup. And my background is in economics and public policy. And I do a lot of work, particularly around kind of the economics of infrastructure and how we get the most out of that, as well as understanding behavioral economics.
Great, thank you all, and welcome to the panel. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to just raise questions. One person is going to take the lead on it, and then the others are going to pile in, and we're going to discuss that for a few minutes, and then we're going to move on to another topic. But we thought we'd start off with a really big one, which is, are we going to get to level 5 autonomy in the next decade? And I want Jay to take the lead on that one, and then see if the others agree or disagree. Off you go.
Right, short answer, no. Reasons why no. Number of reasons. Firstly, it is turning out to be way more complicated than people thought. A recent presentation from VW said that the average luxury car now has 100 million lines of code. An autonomous level 5 car would need 1 billion lines of code, and at $10 a line, that's a lot of money. And also, there's no guarantee that after you've written 1 billion lines, you can debug them and make them work. The thing is that we can have autonomy in level 4. I should just explain. Level 4 autonomy means a vehicle is autonomous within a bounded environment. So that might be an airport, it might be a factory, it might be shuttling people between, say, a train station and a concert venue. Chance will be a fine thing at the moment, but those days will come back. So if you can define the boundary, then you can map everything with that boundary to within a millimetre of its life, and you can run lots and lots of tests and make sure that you have covered all possible eventualities. Level 5 means that you could go from anywhere to anywhere. So it's anytime, any place, anywhere. And the complexities of doing that have made most companies think that it's probably either too complicated, too far in the future, or both, to really worry about too much at the moment. So all the major tier 1 suppliers to the car industry are now refocusing on driver assistance, so level 2 plus, helping people drive their car on the motorway with minimum effort, so keeping the car within the lane, keeping the right distance from the car in front, eventually possibly being able to overtake a car in front automatically without any driver involvement. They are cutting right back or even abandoning their level 5 programs. The car companies take a broadly similar approach, and you could say, well, what about all those disruptors that are going to come in and displace the old-fashioned car companies? Well, that's what people said 10 years ago, and we're still waiting for the disruptors. So the Apple car still doesn't exist, almost certainly never will exist. The Google car, forget it. Google have decided there's far more money in supplying software to car companies, very sensibly, I think. And all the other people have given up. So Dyson gone, lots of other people gone. We don't see any disruptors.
Okay, that's pretty clear where you're coming from on this one. Thank you. I'm going. Nick's smiling. Nick, what do you think? You've got some idea around all those thousands, hundreds, millions of lines of code.
Yeah, well, I think it's difficult to really work out the complexity and cost just from lines of code. But I think it's interesting. I mean, GM have got their cruise program that's actually going to be going like fully autonomous, not even with engineers in the car, on the streets of San Francisco and out in California. You've got Tesla's self-driving car initiative being rolled out in beta. I mean, it's still not going to work perfectly, but that's going to be not highway driving. That's going to be driving on the streets within cities. I think the big disruptors are going to come to the industrial side of things, the logistics side, self-driving trucks and self-piloting sort of aircraft, whether it's drones or self-driving small planes. I think that's where the big disruption is going to come. To say that there's not any disruptors in the world that are going to come in and shake it up, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think GM and I think Tesla are really coming in pretty strong. I think Ford is investing in this area. This is what I'm seeing in North America.
Yeah.
These discussions I'm seeing happen in
I think
the
question is level 5. So back to Jay's anytime, any place, anywhere. And I think probably you all agree, and Jay was saying level 4 is quite likely, and whether that's a defined geofence part of a city or it's a motorway or whatever, that is quite imaginable. But this idea of I can get in my car in Brighton and it can take me to somewhere in Cornwall or West Wales down a very small country lane where there's currently no cell phone coverage. And there's no economic reason why there would possibly ever be cell phone coverage in that area. I think that's the challenge. But I think go on, Patrick. There's an economics issue coming in there.
Well, yeah, I was going to say. I mean, to me, it's there's kind of two questions embedded in there, which is the technology of level 5 going to be feasible in the next couple of decades? I would argue yes, it probably is. But is it something that we're going to see on the streets? I would argue absolutely not. I think it falls into the category of something like the Concorde project that you think of a few years ago. Do we have the technology to build faster planes? Absolutely we do. Does it make sense economically for cities and for individuals if it's not 80 or 90% of the cars on the road? No, not really, because that's when you really start to see the travel time benefits and the safety benefits. And I think that there isn't a case in the next half century, if not the next century, to really invest in the infrastructure to a degree that you have that level of autonomy on city roads.
I'd also add, Patrick, I think that the economic argument needs the one argument I think everybody tends to ignore is that somebody's got to pay for this, and your average punter car buyer right now is really not interested. They don't see they're not absolutely desperate to have more of their freedom taken away, and they certainly, yes, there are elements of convenience where turgid, boring elements of the stuff that they do in cars could be taken away, but most people want their car available for them right there and then. Okay, so that means everyone's got to own their own individual autonomous vehicle, and that's again the economic argument behind, would I pay so much more for one that I don't get to drive? Actually, no. Right now, people are not really that interested in that.
I just want to add to that as well, Fergus, because you make an incredibly good point. This is why car ownership is going to probably be in decline in the future, and we're going to find these subscription on-demand vehicles being able to come pick you up as and when you need them. Lower cost of ownership, no need for maintenance, no need for insurance in a way, but a monthly fee that's convenient and accessible to more people is going to kind of be that model. When you get something like, autonomous vehicles, like truly level 5 autonomous vehicles, then it's not a car per se, it's a transportation mechanism. And
Exactly.
That's where things are going to change. I personally feel.
Yeah, I don't feel there is a... Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, remember, certainly in the United States, the United Kingdom, nobody buys a car today. The proportion of people who buy a car in Britain is now about 5%. Every other car is either a business purchase or a PCP, in which case it is a monthly subscription. And now the car companies are...
Jay, but the thing is, people are buying cars that are theirs, that are literally there when they want it, with their stuff in it.
Yes.
Set to and it's their style of cars. It's saying about them what they want to say.
There's been very interesting experiments done. Well, not experiments, actual commercial attempts to offer for car companies to offer subscriptions. So Mercedes were one of the leaders because they have one of the widest ranges of cars. So they said, if you pay a certain extra amount a month, you can drive any Mercedes, you can swap between the ranges. Two problems with that is that everybody wants to swap at the same time. So in the winter, everybody wants 4x4. Summer, everybody wants a convertible. That's a logistical problem. But the other problem they discovered, which was much more interesting psychologically, was the people who did take it up, and it was abandoned after a year or two because it wasn't commercially viable. But the people who took it up were swapping their cars to begin with every month because it was really good fun. After 6 months, they all stopped swapping them because changing all their stuff and redoing the memory for the seats and all the rest of it, I couldn't be bothered.
Also, you end up with a car that you find is ideal.
Yes, well, that's also true. So the amount of chopping and changing got slowly less and less and less over the course of 2 years.
And what's interesting is Mercedes have a very wide range of vehicles. I mean, a super wide range, which they are changing soon. But what that means is that if your autonomous vehicle fleet is hanging around in some sort of, corral at the end of a city, and you press a button and the car turns up, it has to be suitable for you. It has to be suitable for your neighbor. It has to be suitable. That one particular type of, mobility pod has to suit everybody, and it just won't. So unless you have a Mercedes, a Mercedes-sized fleet parked at the bottom of every city that everybody can just choose whichever one, it's just not going to work. So ultimately, the idea of, and getting back to that kind of point about autonomy level 5, is that frankly, people don't want it. And more to the point, and we have data which shows this concept. If we were putting it through a new product development test, we would stop quite early and say, you guys really need to get into a different business, because nobody wants this. Nobody has said this is what I'm missing. And obviously you have Apple very famously, it's not up to people to know what they want, but it is up to people to know what they like. And frankly, at the moment, they don't like it. And, it's not going to give them what they want.
I think it's beyond whether they like it or not. I think it's whether they see the added benefit. So right now, that service that you're describing in terms of pressing a button, I can do that. It's called Uber or any other private hire vehicle, and I'm not driving it. I can do whatever the heck I want in the back of that vehicle. And so the marginal difference between to a point, to keep well, I do care about my Uber rating, but we won't get into that. I think the marginal difference between that and sitting in an autonomous vehicle that I don't entirely trust because it's relatively new technology, and not necessarily getting the exact type of vehicle I want or the type of pod, I don't see the marginal benefit for me that would make me say I absolutely need that service over a private hire vehicle that I can get right now.
A level 5 autonomy has to be better than a human brain, which is, as far as we know, the most powerful, pound for pound, the most powerful computer in the world. And if you're going to invent something that's more powerful than that, and by the way, it takes 18 years in most countries to train that human brain to be good enough to drive on the road, and still they're not very good at it, because look at teenage insurance rates.
Fergus, I think let's move on a little bit, and in fact we veered a little bit into shared ownership there. Now, Fergus, I know you've done Seventh Sense. You've done quite a lot of surveys of attitudes that break down by different age groups, and there's this idea that Gen Z's really into shared ownership. So you can tell me what your analysis of Gen Z and their approach, whether they might be more or less open to generally shared ownership, maybe mobility as a service. And then we'll ask Patrick, because he probably is Gen Z, I don't know.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
Flattering, but not quite.
So what we found in both, we've done two waves of research, one last year, one this year, with 3,000 people in the UK, to understand their attitudes towards travel of all sorts, but particularly in terms of autonomy and shared, and well, the case factors actually. And in terms of shared, whilst, as you mentioned, Patrick, you know, you could call an Uber and they could do that stuff if they want to. Gen Z are absolutely, obviously living that particular lifestyle in cities where they have that opportunity. They don't tend to own cars. We've seen the age of new car purchases just continually move higher and higher every year. It gets a year older, because young people aren't buying cars. They don't particularly want to buy cars. That means they ought to be absolutely prime for sharing these things. But what it turns out is that when we look at the idea of shared vehicles or shared mobility, they are not as into it as you might expect. In fact, they are less trusting of this technology and less into this technology than Gen X or millennials particularly are the ones who are really championing this, as saying we think this is a great idea. You get to Gen Z, they are suspicious of the technology, possibly because they know more about it. They are also very concerned with outward appearance. So whilst they're happy enough to tool around in an Uber or something that's very much a utility in terms of travel, when it's non-utility travel, when they're going somewhere to do something, or they want to show up somewhere and be someone and be seen, they want to have their thing and they want to own their thing, because owning a thing is about outward expression. Gen Z are very much about outward expression, just thinking about the Instagram generation. They want people to see that they have this thing. Now, is also a generational aspect, whereas if you look at this stuff and you say to people in the silent generation and the boomers, and even to an extent Gen X, are you really interested in buying a luxury car now? Far fewer of them, as they get older, really are interested, because basically they're like, now I've done everything I need to do, I'm not that bothered. Gen Z are still very ambitious and have a view of the future, which is I could still yet become, you know, incredibly wealthy, and that's still an appealing objective for them. But they're not all piling into the concept that they want to share their luxury vehicle or share their sports vehicle or share their SUV, which unfortunately they are still very interested in owning SUVs, that they haven't all turned into eco warriors. Although, you know, we can argue whether the SUVs of the future, when we have our Rivians and our electric Hummers, could well be more or less impactful than the ones that they're being offered at the moment. But no, Gen Z, I think two key things to think about with Gen Z. A, they know a lot about this technology and they don't like it much, or not as much as millennials who seem to trust it implicitly. And also, they are very keen to express themselves. And the vehicle, or owning a vehicle, is one of the key ways that anybody can demonstrate their position in society. Is the car that they drive, is the hierarchical nature of luxury or premium or sports or whatever, to express the kind of person you are and the kind of place that you're going or where you've got to right now. So no, are Gen Zs just going to opt for not buying cars anymore? Absolutely not. They may, of course, look for a kind of Uber Max transportation system that may well be very interesting to them, and that could be shared. But no, they want their cars and they want them there.
Patrick, what's the economic evidence for whether these models are going to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would tend to agree with that. I mean, I think let's take the kind of past 8 or 9 months of the pandemic as an example. And I think, and I don't have a huge amount of stats to back this up, but if you look anecdotally at the number of people from my generation that I know that have purchased a car in the past 8 months because they've realized they can't take rail, they can't get around the country in other ways, and it provides them a degree of freedom that they could otherwise not afford at this time. I think that becomes a question of what are the enduring impacts of something like that. And I think that really poses into the question the model of why did they choose to invest in a vehicle, in a private vehicle, rather than investing in a zip car or another type of shared service that could achieve that same thing. And I think Fergus nails it on the head when he talks about there is a certain outward-facing nature of this generation, and that says they don't want to show up in a zip car that's branded and a tiny little vehicle that you press on the gas and you wait 4 seconds and then maybe the ignition kicks in, and are looking for something that they can at least represent as, even if it's a used car from 20 years ago, as their own, and it gives them that freedom to enable that. And I think that's something that is potentially a major challenge as we look forward over the next kind of 20 years.
I think there's something really interesting that I just want to chime in on. I had lunch with a friend of mine that actually runs a sort of an e-scooter, e-bike company, and she's got a notable influencer, a rap star called Ray J, that sort of representing the brand. And I think that part of this is the business model stroke cultural acceptance. And I think that, to think that Gen Z are just looking at cars, I'm wondering if there's also Gen Z are looking at other mode shifts, electric scooters and other ways of getting around cities that are becoming more culturally acceptable. And I'm wondering if there's a sort of an automotive model of the future, the provision of vehicles that are, give some kind of kudos to the use of them, whether that's because they're electric and they're better for the environment, or whether they're connected in certain ways, or they've got entertainment systems, they're fully autonomous and whatever. So I wonder if that cultural shift is something that sort of, it needs to happen. I mean, us Gen Xers are sort of techno fetishists, and we kind of leap onto new things and we love them. The Gen Z are, just like you're saying, Fergus, they want to be popular, they want to be loved, but maybe the things that they're going to be loved for are going to change over time.
Yeah, it's pretty good. But I think Jay made a great point earlier as well, which was that actually nobody's really buying cars anymore. Nobody's buying a car that they own, and actually that is a separation. But it's certainly and so moving to slightly different models of that, of course, I think is going to be possible. But when you give somebody the choice, like, are you going to share this? No, thanks. By far the most popular. There are various different. We looked into all sorts of different payment methods and so on, and there's just a huge morass of different opinions about how they would pay for it. But how would you want to own this? How would you want to possess this product? I want it, my car on my driveway, and that actually is pretty level amongst all generations, but it does not dip in the way that you would expect it to with Gen Z. They are very much, no, if I'm going to have something, it's going to be mine, and I'm going to have it on my driveway. And they don't own it, obviously. They're paying interest on the interest, or whatever it happens to be. But that feeling of ownership, and as Patrick made a great point as well around freedom, if it's shared with somebody, that means I don't think it's not right here, right now. I can't get in it now and go and do that thing. So it's taken some of the freedom away. If it's autonomous, that's taken some of the freedom away. If it's governed and I'm being spied on, that's taken some of the freedom away. And that's one of the few places you still have agency is in vehicles. And that's going to be difficult for us to get rid of.
Just on that subject, I completely agree with what you say, Fergus. I think there's also a fundamental engineering problem here, that if you are going to be shuttled around in a vehicle, what that vehicle needs for you is lots of space and lots of interior comfort. That's fine. If you're going to drive yourself, what you want is something that is fun to drive, and therefore more sporty, lower, and more constricted interior, because you don't move while you're driving. So fundamentally, the engineering for a car that is autonomous is totally unsuitable for a car that is going to be driven by its owner stroke subscriber, and vice versa. You can't have a car that's suitable for both. It just, they contradict each other. It's just a logical contradiction. It's not a design problem. It's just logic.
There's a company called Zoox, I think, out of Silicon Valley as well, that's just sort of literally reinventing what a car even looks like. Right?
Yeah, well, yes. No comment on things.
Okay, so I'm going to move this one on, actually, if we may. And Patrick, you tee yourself up to answer this one. But there's an issue that ever since we started Highways UK in 2015, we've been told you can't talk about road user charging. It's a kind of taboo area within the DFT. They got their fingers burnt at one point many decades ago, and there was a big campaign against it, and it's kind of never really spoken about publicly. But Patrick, put your Canadian economics hat on and tell us whether you think road user charging will never happen in the UK, or maybe it will.
Yeah, I mean, as a Canadian, Nick, you might correct me, but I think it'll happen in the UK far before it'll happen in Canada. Would be my view. But and I would actually argue that it is happening and it already is a thing. So if we look at the way it's being done through the cities because it isn't being done at a national level. And you look at low emission zones, you look at the congestion charging zone in London. It exists. That type of charging infrastructure is not something that's being put in place for internal combustion engines over the next 10 years. That's being put in place as a long-term solution to how we fund our road infrastructure. And I think the challenge that I would think from a national government and the kind of pushback I would say to somebody from a DFT that's saying it's not, we don't want to talk about it, it's not the thing that we want to bring up, is that they're just losing the game, because the point is that now cities are making the decisions of how those structures work and how those systems are being put in place, and they're losing the opportunity to define that system that works most efficiently and effectively from a national scale, and the cities are the ones that are benefiting from that. So I mean, I think it becomes an interesting challenge of, it is happening, it's going to continue. I am under no illusion that when we move in, and I think we'll come on to talk about electrification later, but when we move into further electric fleets over the next couple decades, that low emission zones are going to suddenly go away and we're not going to have any charging for going into cities anymore. Those systems are going to transform to serve other purposes and to achieve other kind of social and political aims of our city leaders. So I think the opportunity now is that we're in the midst, or the beginning to the midst of this kind of period of transition away from the internal combustion engine, which is, regardless of what people say, is the biggest change in automobiles in the past century. And this is the opportunity at a national level to fundamentally look at how are we paying for our infrastructure in a different way than we have over the past century. And I think that's the challenge in front of us from a national level. And right now we're just kind of ignoring it and letting the cities take lead.
Okay,
if
that's
I
great.
could just
Let's go on.
Sorry, if you just come in there. As it happens, before I started working for government, I knew a guy who was a very senior official to a cabinet minister. And I'd never met one of those before. And I said, well, what about road charging? Surely that's a sensible thing to do. And he rolled his eyes and he said, don't talk about bloody road charging. He said, we have done analyses for the Treasury. There isn't a single tax change in Britain that you can model that has more benefits and fewer disadvantages than road pricing. Everybody knows economically it's the only sane thing to do. And everybody knows politically it's absolutely impossible. People will riot in this and other countries over 5p on the price of a litre of petrol. You handle anything to do with cars, petrol and taxes at your peril, and we just won't do it. We keep asking the politicians to do it and nobody will. I agree with every word that Patrick said. Logically, he's absolutely right. Just how on earth do we do it?
Yeah,
but
so
go on, Patrick. I was going to say, but just throw another point in, because we're going to segue into the next bit. What happens when we don't have petrol, so we're not worried about the 5p? So let's segue into the electrification, the rate of electrification as well.
Completely, but I think I'll just add on that. I think the problem is that by avoiding the conversation of how do we do it effectively, we're avoiding the ability to find creative solutions. And I'll put one out there that I think is, and it's not directly in the road area, but it's in the travel area, which is one of the most brilliant campaigns. And this came out of Canada, so apologies if I keep bringing Canada up, but there's an app in Canada called Carrot, which was co-sponsored and funded by the public health department of the government of Canada, as well as the government of Ontario. And what it does is it sets a daily step count that you should be achieving to be a healthy individual walking around. And it sets that initially at 10,000 steps that you need to take a day. And it sits on your phone, it sits on my pocket, doesn't cost me anything, totally free. If I hit my 10,000 steps every day, I get points towards taking a flight. I get airplane points, reward points to be able to fly somewhere. Doesn't cost me anything, but I can tell you the number of times at 11:50 at night, for a minuscule amount of points that really don't mean anything, I walk around in circles around my flat, in a very small London flat, I might add. So it's a bit sad, but the point is, there are ways to incentivize and change behavior that isn't all about entirely penalizing. So I think by avoiding the conversation, one of the things that we've done is we haven't explored a huge array of solutions, because all we think of is the kind of classic cordon congestion pricing or kind of flat fee congestion pricing that is kind of a very 1980s, 1990s approach, I would argue, to thinking about congestion pricing.
I think in general people know that it's expensive. Sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, that's good. It's actually interesting. I mean, here in Toronto, we've got the 407, which is like an express route, and you do pay per use, but that means that you don't have traffic. So there's an actual benefit. And I think you need to really draw out those clear benefits. When you build a new bridge, typically there's tolls, but there's no real benefit because you're just using a bridge that's replacing an older bridge. So then it gets a little funky. But I drive an electric vehicle, so I can actually go into the HOV lanes, so high occupancy vehicle lanes, on my own. I don't need to have other people in the car. So these kinds of incentives to sort of change behavior, I think you're absolutely right there, Patrick. I think that these are going to be there. Now, somewhere like North America has got much more space to build more roads, so you can try these things out. Somewhere like the UK does not. But maybe there's opportunities for certain lanes to have incentivized different kinds of usage, like HOV and electric vehicles, or even pay per use, so that people can actually get through a little quicker. So I don't know. I think this is the big sort of cultural shift in the behavioral change thing that I think this entire conversation is talking about. It takes about 30 years for new technologies to seep into culture. So says Paul Sappho over at Stanford. I just think we're on a slow burn, but suddenly the future is here faster than ever, right?
And how fast are we going to get to electric vehicles? And is that the destination in terms of low carbon powertrain?
Well, I've been driving full electric. I drive a Chevrolet Bolt for 2 years. I lived in British Columbia, where there was huge incentives. I got like $12,000 off my vehicle because I could scrap my old Subaru, which was 20 years old, and actually get another $5,000 from the government. These kinds of things are starting to really sort of pick up pace. Still very few cars on the road are electric. If you look around, like go to California, there's very, very few electric vehicles at all, and the infrastructure's not there. But the next 10 to 15 years, as people like Ford start making more electric vehicles, and people within the workforce are starting to think that this is a good idea and acceptable culturally, we're going to see this shift happen. But I think we're still a good 15, 20 years before we get to a point where electric vehicles are dominant on the roads.
I think that's a fair point, but the key thing about electric vehicles is they're just so much better. A vast improvement on a crazy exploding contraption in the front of your car, like thousands of explosions a second with this highly, flammable liquid that you're dragging around with you. Now, I'll declare an interest here. If you cut me, I bleed petrol, 4-star actually, and leaded 4-star. But you only have to look at those products to realize how much better an electric vehicle is. It has only 20% of the components of an internal combustion engine car, so much less to go wrong. As a manufacturer, you've got a massive incentive. You can close down vast numbers of factories and charge the same, or at the moment, even more than you were charging for a much, much more complicated product before. They last longer, they don't need servicing. You've got a problem with the fact that there's no need for that huge estate of service centers anymore, but then they don't have to pay those guys. So again, that's another win for the manufacturers. And they're quieter, they're faster, they're more exciting. They don't sound as good. You can't fix them yourself. But, like horses, there'll be a few of us on the weekend mucking about with these things in fields. But basically, electric cars are, of course, going to be the future. Everybody will see how much better they are once we've sorted out the infrastructure, but that's not a big deal. For cars, that is. Obviously, large vehicles, another matter altogether, probably hydrogen. But really, people will see the advantage. They'll like them more. And the kind of crazy, relationship that people like me have with machines will just not be relevant.
And Fergus, I think you touched on I was just going to say, I think you touched on a really interesting thing there that we talked about earlier, but about the changing economics of ownership of vehicles and how electrification actually fundamentally changes that game. Because if you talk about a current kind of combustion petrol vehicle, it might last, 10, 20 years if you go through kind of serious refurbishments over that time. The length of or the longevity of an electric vehicle, given the fewer number of parts, given the ability to easily replace and refurbish those vehicles, means that ownership might actually change in the way that's structured. And it doesn't mean that it necessarily goes away from the kind of you want your own and it's there, but that might necessarily not need to be a new 2019 model or a 2020 model. It could be a vehicle that's been around for 30, 40 years and just has a new battery in it and a new coat of paint. I mean, what's the fundamental change otherwise, you ask?
Yeah. Jay, can I bring you in there? Just the there are targets, particularly with cars, about not selling internal combustion engine vehicles after 2035 at the moment. What's the government doing, to your knowledge, to support that?
Well, obviously the government wants to electrify the UK. It's putting a lot of money into incentives, into charge point infrastructure. There's a debate going on at the moment. Got some Road to Zero 2 years ago, said 2040, and there's now a consultation going on whether to bring it forward. It could be brought forward to 2035. Some people are suggesting 2032. No decision has been made yet, but one is expected soon. In terms of just what we've heard about before, I'd just make a couple of points. Electric cars in terms of price. Remember that all the car companies making electric cars are taking far lower margins on their electric cars than they are on their petrol cars. That's kind of what they have to do to build up market share, increase production, get down the learning curve. But electric cars are intrinsically expensive. Batteries are very expensive. Some people tend to think of electric cars as just a battery on wheels. Don't forget, a battery is only the equivalent of a fuel tank. And a fuel tank only costs $50 to make. You've still got to have a motor. You've still got to have a transmission. Simpler, but it's still a transmission. You've got to have an awful lot of very fancy power electronics to control some very high voltages. So the cost of the powertrain in an electric vehicle in terms of the motor and the power electronics isn't massively different from the price of a basic petrol engine. Then you've got the cost of the battery. And that's the problem the car industry is grappling with, that battery cars are more expensive to make, and the amount people are prepared to pay for them doesn't yet equate to the full cost plus their traditional profit margin. Now, total cost of ownership is better because you don't have to buy petrol. Electricity is cheaper than petrol because it's not taxed, which takes us back to our earlier conversation. So you can tell people that over 5 years or 10 years an electric car will be cheaper, but it's not cheaper to buy, or it's not cheaper in its monthly PCP rate, which is still an issue. In terms of percentages, most engineering consultancies who've looked at this tend to agree that worldwide, 2030, we're probably looking around 25-30% battery electric, more in some markets, less in others. But if Britain's serious about being 100% in the early 2030s, we're going to look like a bit of an outlier. The EU has mandated a CO2 target by 2030, which is going to mean pretty well all cars are going to have to be hybrid at least, and a lot are going to be electric. But 100% by 2030 is really pushing it. Getting there by 2040, possible. Of course, we have to be careful that the point is we want zero emission. How we get zero emission we shouldn't get hung up on. Whether that turns out to be hydrogen for larger vehicles, probably not smaller vehicles, is one possibility. But there are also experiments going on with zero emission fuels. You could take hydrogen, add waste CO2, and after all, we've got plenty of that. You would create an artificial or a synthesized hydrocarbon, which would have no net CO2 because you'd just be recycling CO2 that was already in the atmosphere. Now, I'm not saying that's the answer, but there is more than one answer. The question is how do we get to zero emission? It shouldn't be how do we get to battery electric, because that's prejudging the answer, and I think that's dangerous.
It is very much, and actually, there's the argument for synthetic fuels is even greater when you look at the concept of, do we really need, if reducing our carbon emissions is the target, is replacing every single vehicle on the road in the UK a good way of reducing CO2? Does that not in itself create an awful lot of CO2 by creating massively complex industrial products? It's not the best answer. The best answer, of course, is to stick to sort of late 90s V12s with synthetic fuel, of course, because they're
obviously
the best.
Well, I'm not sure about that one, Fergus.
I think it's interesting. I just want to add one thing on electric. I like to watch countries like Norway that have really gone gung-ho into this. Was it like 52.8% fully electric and PHEV 17.4%, and that's total market share there. I mean, they've surrounded the switch to electric with incentives, whatever. It is a smaller country, it's a fairly affluent country. There's lots of benefits, like in terms of like free parking, cheaper ferry rides, cheaper road usage and whatever that comes with that. So I kind of watch these little sort of outliers to sort of show us some models that are being tested. I don't know, it's difficult to really roll that up into countries like the UK, where there's so many more people and such an old infrastructure in place as well.
Okay, we're right on our time. But I do want to, if I'll go around you all, if you can say 20 seconds on anything that you either hasn't been said or you want to emphasize. Fergus, go on. Put you on the spot.
Autonomy is going to give us the opportunity to get rid of a whole load of mundane tasks that are done with cars, and posits a bright future for a whole load of really cool, interesting cars that you'll want to drive, because all the crap will have been taken away and car companies will be able to build stuff that's just cool.
Thank you. Patrick.
So I'll just say really quick, I was having a interesting debate last night with some of my flatmates about COVID, because that's what you do now on a typical weekday night. But we were discussing
the long winter evenings.
Exactly. There's going to be a lot of those. But we were discussing kind of what is the likelihood of this type of pandemic happening again in the next 10 or 20 years. And what we said is what we can't control. And I think this goes to the point of disruption and innovation, is exactly what technologies are going to emerge. And I think Jay made this point that we shouldn't try and prejudge that conclusion. But what we can do, and what we can do a lot better, I would argue, particularly in thinking of the public sector and cities, is how we react and how we respond to those challenges, and doing that in a much more nimble and a much more effective and quick way. So thinking about things like e-scooters and electrification and regulation of new types of vehicle technology, we have to be way quicker and way more nimble about how we respond and how we react and how we adjust our policies, because that's actually how we're going to incorporate these things and take the most advantage of these things in our society. So I think that's, to me, what I would say is the big kind of challenge facing the public sector in the next decade.
Great, thank you. And Jay, any final thoughts?
I'd say two things. One, just pick up what Fergus said. Totally agree. It's about automation rather than autonomy. Get rid of the boring bits, keep the fun bits. Second thing is we have to be very careful when we're looking at emissions to look at the whole picture. Just one example. Mazda, who are always an outlier when it comes to engineering, are refusing to make a car with a large battery. They say a car with a small battery and a very small range extender engine will give lower lifetime CO2 costs, because you don't have to invest a load of CO2 in making the battery in the first place. So I'm not saying they're right, I'm not saying they're wrong, but it's a very interesting question, and we have to take a bigger picture, because if we make huge batteries in a very CO2 inefficient way, we're going to increase net emissions, not decrease them. So we need to be careful.
Thank you. And Nick, go on, one more go from you.
Yeah, so what I do is, I look historically at changes, and then I look to the future. What I've actually found is that, change is inevitable, and people really shape that future as well. People were scared of bikes when they first came out in Italy. People were scared of cars when they first came out. People didn't think that renewable energy was going to become dominant, and people thought that private space travel wasn't going to be realistic in any kind of time frame. I think that when we think of level 5, artificial general intelligence, new kinds of infrastructure, full electric infrastructure, electrification, I just think that we're just delaying our thinking to catch up to where the technology could be. I think by 2050, the world's going to operate completely differently.
Okay, that's great. We're going to have to wrap this up, but to the audience, I hope you've enjoyed this very diverse range of views on the future of mobility, and I hope that you've heard some things that you maybe haven't heard before. And if you're wondering why we're talking about these big trends in mobility without what we normally do at Highways UK is delve down into the impacts on the infrastructure. Well, this is a way to take a slightly bigger look at what might be happening, and then it's for you as the audience to decide how that is going to impact on how we use road space and how we enable the infrastructure to support the sorts of things we've heard about today. So I'd like to thank my panel, and I can hear maybe hundreds of people virtually clapping in their living rooms. So thank you very much indeed. Okay, cheers, bye-bye.